You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda from New York City, and I'm delighted today to be joined by the Diplomats editor-in-chief, Shannon Tiesi. Shannon, thank you for joining me.
Always a pleasure, Ankit.
Well, as our listeners can probably anticipate, this is the first podcast since we've gotten determinate results in what has been a rocky U.S. election. And actually, today we're recording this on November 13th, and China, along with most of the rest of the world, has acknowledged that Joe Biden will be the next president of the United States. So I'm planning on a few episodes around this theme, basically, because I know this has been, there's been a lot of demand, first of all, from listeners. I apologize for not recording an episode for a bit. Things have been hectic, but we will try to cover the implications of the U.S. election outcome for various parts of Asia, beginning today with China. And of course, always when I talk China, there's no one I'd rather have on than Shannon. So Shannon, thanks a lot for being here.
Yeah, Ankit, I always love joining the podcast.
So I think the place to start is there's a view out there that Joe Biden's election victory signals a return to policy in Asia, policy towards China, really picking off where things left off in 2016, or really January 20th, 2017, when the Obama administration left office. I have some doubts about that. I'm wondering what you think about that when it comes specifically to China. Have Democrats moved on from where they were back then, or is China policy going to look a lot like it did under Obama?
I can understand why people might think that. Particularly, there have been a lot of concerns raised by analysts based in Asia who are hoping for a tougher U.S.-China stance. And it's because a lot of the people affiliated with the Biden campaign and being rumored for prominent positions in a Biden cabinet are Obama administration stalwarts. Obviously, Biden himself was Obama's vice president. So you have a lot of the same figures expected to staff agencies at state, the Department of Defense, and things like that. Of course, it's what we typically do is we would go back and look at these people's histories to try and predict what they're going to do in the future, right? So people are thinking, is this going to be Obama 2.0 on China? I agree with you. I don't think that's particularly likely. The general mood in the U.S. toward China has soured immensely, particularly in 2020. But really, I think since around 2015, 2016, right around the time when the Obama administration was coming to an end. And there's a really deep bipartisan consensus that I think all of the Biden figures would probably fit into now, that has said, okay, China's actions have gotten more blatant, more assertive, and the response that we had in the past to deal with this is clearly not working. So we need to do something new. So I do think we are going to see a new approach on China. What that actually looks like, obviously, is the big question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and That I think takes us nicely to another point that I wanted to bring up, which is that we have this interesting. So you pointed to a bipartisan consensus. What we know from the Obama era is when we have a Democratic president, and what is likely to be, we don't know until the Georgia runoffs come in, likely to be either a Republican-controlled Senate, 52-48, or a very narrowly Republican-controlled Senate. What does that tell us about the kinds of Senate confirmable appointments we might see in a Biden cabinet? I mean, it seems like anybody maybe favoring a return to the Obama era style engagement and managing competition with China might not be favored, but Republicans might be willing to play ball with Biden on certain items on the China agenda. What's your expectation there?
In terms of confirmations, I think the biggest thing that Republican Senate would do is probably torpedo poor Susan Rice's bid from becoming Secretary of State again.
Mm-hmm.
They already, in the Obama administration, they already had to drop that and just make her national security advisor because Senate confirmation was a bridge too far. I think there's a lot of room for cooperation between a Biden administration and a Republican Congress. As much as Trump has tried to create this image of himself as being tough on China, we've also seen some unwillingness on his part, some delays at actually signing into law some of these bills that passed Congress with huge margins, imposing sanctions on human rights violations in Hong Kong and against the Uyghurs. So I think a Biden administration is probably going to be more willing to work with Congress on these laws rather than the impression that I always got from Trump was he was signing them because he felt like he had to. You don't want to have an embarrassing veto override on a China issue where he's trying to paint himself as tough. I don't think we're going to see a whole lot of substantial pushback from the Republicans on anything Biden wants to do on China. I think more what we're going to see is accusations that he's not doing enough and he's not being tough enough.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about trade, which I know is a big issue for not only investors around the world, but certainly I think the American people, Congress, very much interested in what is going to happen with the Trump administration initiated trade war. And trade war is not just with China, but including with many of our allies. But on the China piece of this, so Biden has said a lot during the campaign on trade policy, and the general expectation seems to be a move away from tariffs as a tool of trade warfare and a greater focus on non-tariff barriers, things like supply chain integrity, integrating like-minded democracies in a network of economic cooperation. Is that the right framing through which we should be thinking about this issue, or are you expecting any surprises from a Biden administration? I think one issue is to which I'm not particularly optimistic about, is will the Biden administration rethink the value of multilateral trade agreements in Asia? And of course, this is a great week to talk about that, with moves happening on the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which the U.S. is not a part of, and of course, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership has also moved on in Asia after the Trump administration withdrew in its first week in office back in January 2017. So what's your expectation on the U.S.-China trade front under a Biden presidency?
I think that Biden is going to try to partner more with U.S. allies in confronting China, whether that's on security issues or economic issues. He's made that abundantly clear. So I think one of the biggest things we're going to see is the Trump administration had kind of a scattershot approach to these tariffs, right? Which is they're not only putting tariffs on China, you also had tariffs on, steel imports from a large number of U.S. allies. You just had Vietnam declared a currency manipulator when the United States is also trying to recruit Vietnam to join its, Indo-Pacific Strategy Coalition. And you had Trump threatening sanctions or tariffs on automobile imports from Japan and the European Union. Really kind of undercutting any hope for an allied multilateral approach to these China trade issues. So I think what Biden is going to do first and foremost is roll back the sanctions on U.S. allies and partner countries. Whether he actually rolls back the sanctions on China is a trickier question because, again, that's going to be ripe for Republicans to say, oh, he's cozy on China, he's not tough enough. So that we're going to have to wait and see. I certainly don't think he's going to impose any new ones in the immediate term.
Mm-hmm. Well,
as for trade agreements, I don't think that's going to be top of the priority list. He's expressed interest. He's tried to frame this as these deals are happening and it's better for the U.S. if we're part of them than on the outside looking in. But, with the Republicans having shifted under Trump to not show much interest in these deals, and the Democrats have always been fairly skeptical of them because of the concern that they're going to cost U.S. jobs. I think we might see some interest in starting negotiations, but actually signing on to TPP is going to expend a lot of political capital for Biden, and that might not be at the top of his priority list.
Yeah, no, I mean, neither major party in the United States is really interested in multilateral trade, even though Biden is generally interested in multilateralism on a range of issues, unlike the Trump administration. You made an interesting point, which was that a lot of, not just on trade, but Biden rolling back certain Trump administration moves on China will very easily, I think, be framed as, oh, look, the Democrats are soft on China, they're rewarding Xi Jinping. And this is also interesting in the context of the transition that we're now undergoing. And, calling it a transition is a little strange because the president, of course, hasn't conceded the election yet. And Biden hasn't officially been acknowledged by the federal government to be president elect, granting him access to federal facilities and funds. But nevertheless, I mean, there is this concern that Trump might take dramatic actions on China, Taiwan, other issues that could lock Biden into a certain course of action. And then releasing any of that pressure will then be turn into a political football in Congress. Anyways, so is that something that worries you? The possibility of Biden being locked in by certain late actions by Trump during this lame duck period, or is that something that's been overblown a little?
I think it's a possibility. I mean, first, for that to happen, you would have to have an acknowledgement from the Trump administration that this is going to be a lame duck period, which, as you said, even Pompeo has supposedly joked that we're going to have a second Trump administration. And we saw just this week the first executive order that Trump issued on China since the election result was called, where he's moved forward to ban U.S. investors from putting their funds into companies linked to the Chinese military. I don't think we're going to see anything major. There were some rumors pre-election that the U.S. was going to attack one of the Chinese islands in the South China Sea. And, you're definitely getting into the ludicrous at that point. But all of these little actions do take a toll. So every executive order that Trump signs on, restrictions on Chinese companies. Let's say, all of the sanctions on Huawei in particular, on Chinese surveillance and other tech firms, banning U.S. investment in these Chinese companies. They all would potentially need to be undone by a Biden administration. And every single one of those opens Biden up for criticism, right? From Republicans and even potentially fellow Democrats who think that he's being soft on China and not being tough enough. So it puts Biden in a position where he has to look at this and say, okay, which of these do I actually want to overturn in this huge avalanche of actions that the Trump administration has taken? I would say, though, there's also an opportunity there for Biden because he essentially will have a lot of leverage over the Chinese government. He can say, I'm willing to overturn some of these. What are you going to do to make it worth my while? Essentially, he doesn't have to take the reputational hit of having enacted any of these punitive measures because Trump's already done that. But he could potentially reap some of the benefits of overturning them. So there's actually an opportunity there if they're willing to work with Beijing.
Mm-hmm. So let's turn a little bit now to areas of cooperation between the two sides. I mean, the Biden administration, I think, one of the important ways in which they differ from the Trump administration will be their views on climate change, for instance. They've been quite clear that this is an area where they will have to cooperate with China and really every other country in the world to make any kind of difference. So when it comes to issues like climate change, nonproliferation, North Korea, even managing COVID-19, I believe they've hinted at reopening the CDC office in China. What's your expectation for the way in which the Biden administration is going to approach cooperation with China in these areas where it is necessary, while managing competition and perhaps even intensifying competition in other areas?
I think that is a very tricky thing to do, if only because the Chinese government tends to cross-link these issues and say, well, if you are not willing to meet us halfway on trade or respect our core interests in Hong Kong and Xinjiang, why would we work with you on North Korea, for example? I think one area that is really ripe for cooperation, though, as you mentioned, is climate change. And that's because the Chinese government, I think at this point, recognizes it's in China's best interest to take aggressive action on climate change, both because China has its own environmental problems and China is very vulnerable to issues like water scarcity and pollution and natural disasters. With the flooding we saw along the Yangtze River this year, but also because there's a huge opportunity there for China to become a global leader in renewable energy and reap economic benefits from that. So I think the Biden administration needs to to get rid of the conception that a lot of Obama era officials had, that the United States needs to cajole China to make climate change commitments, and that it's in the United States' interest to do this, but it's something China needs to be convinced and bargained with to do. They need to drop that attitude. China doesn't need to be convinced to do this. China is already doing this, right, of its own accord. It's kind of assumed the mantle of climate change leadership. So this isn't something that you need to, will bend here if China will make climate change progress. It's more a matter of, both our governments are committed to climate change progress. How can we synchronize what we're doing to maximize the benefits for the world? And here again, I think multilateralism is going to be key. Obviously, the European Union has put a lot of effort into talking with China on climate issues. If you can get the United States and the European Union, and now Japan and South Korea, who have also made their own promises about net zero carbon emissions, all in the room talking to China at the same time, then I think that'd be a very encouraging sign for climate progress. And it's not something that, okay, we need to sacrifice what we're saying about Hong Kong, for example, to get China to make these climate change commitments.
Yeah, no. I think, yeah, absolutely. I think that'll be something key to watch. Let's flip back to a few of the difficult issues. You know, you mentioned Hong Kong a few times and Xinjiang. So there'll be a lot of I think a lot of eyes on how the Biden administration is going to address these issues. Democrats traditionally have, to the extent possible, tried to incorporate a more values-oriented approach to the practice of American foreign policy, and certainly these challenges are much greater now than they were under Obama under Obama at any time, and the campaign has been quite open about this. Biden, during one of the debates, addressed these issues as well. Certainly taking a very strong, strident stance against what's happening in Xinjiang and Hong Kong. When in office, though, I mean, priorities change, as you said. I mean, there is a cooperative agenda. There's also the issue of focusing on other parts of the agenda with China. So presidents often, campaign in poetry and govern in prose. So how will a Biden administration look to sort of thread the needle when it comes to pressuring China on Hong Kong and Xinjiang? Will we see more sanctions applied on party officials complicit in human rights violations and the crackdowns in Hong Kong, or will we simply see a more rhetorical approach on these issues?
This is a very interesting question that I don't think we have an answer to as yet. On the one hand, Biden has a long history, even dating back to his time in the Senate in 1989, right after the crackdown on the Tiananmen protesters, of speaking out about China's human rights violations and of advocating for the United States to take a tougher stance on them. And as you said, during this campaign, he's spoken out on what's going on in Xinjiang, the oppression of the Uyghurs and other Muslim Turkic groups, and also the national security lie on Hong Kong and what that means for the country's, one country, two systems. But on the other hand, he's always had kind of a pragmatist streak. And when he was vice president, he would speak out about these human rights issues, but he would also acknowledge that there's only so much the United States can do, right? Like, it's incredibly difficult for the United States to come up with a policy that is going to make China change how it's approaching Xinjiang or Hong Kong, because the Chinese government sees those as core national security issues that it doesn't have any room to change on. That's not to say that we shouldn't try and that there shouldn't be consequences for what China is doing. But I think that Biden is a realist in the sense that he understands it's going to be very difficult to actually force change on these issues. And that might play into how far he's willing to go. His campaign has talked about sanctions. It's criticized Trump for being weak on these issues and said that we need to have more sanctions. I think, again, here we can expect to see a more multilateral approach. If the United States is able to get some of its European allies on board with some sort of punitive sanctions, that might have more of an impact on China.
Mm-hmm. And another issue, and I know we could do an entire podcast on this particular one, is the Taiwan issue. The U.S.-Taiwan relationship under Trump, I think, has been something that generally I think there were early concerns in Taiwan that they'd turn into a political football or a bargaining chip between the U.S. and China. But of late, in 2020 at least, I think things have turned around. I mean, you've just in the past few weeks seen the approval of major arms sales, which I think there's more of a debate on the Democratic side of the aisle about the proper relationship with Taiwan going forward, the extent to which the United States should be making positive and affirmative efforts to retain preserve the status quo in the Taiwan Strait. What's your expectation here under Biden? I know that this is something on which the Democratic Party is quite divided in terms of the proper course of action and what the U.S. should be doing. How do you think the president will thread this particular needle?
Um, yeah, this is going to be something to watch. And our one of our Taiwan correspondent, Nick Aspinwall, wrote an article about this, about how Taiwan has had a kind of a bad experience with Democratic presidents. Under the Obama administration, there's a lot of dissatisfaction in Taiwan, particularly when Tsai Ing-wen initially ran for president in 2012. When Obama was in power, she had some meetings with officials at the State Department in Washington, D.C., and they came out of that meeting and leaked to the press sort of a negative opinion of her. So that created some bad blood. And then you have the Trump administration come out very strong for Taiwan, starting with before he's even inaugurated, Trump having a phone call with Tsai Ing-wen as president-elect. And people are already saying, is Biden going to be willing to do that? And most people don't think that he will. So there, you can draw that comparison there. And so you actually had Taiwan's foreign minister went on Twitter and thanked the Trump administration for their support for Taiwan directly after Tsai Ing-wen congratulated Joe Biden and Kamala Harris on their victory. So there is a lot of wistfulness, I guess you could say. Taiwan is not quite sure what a Biden administration is going to mean for them. I think it's tough to say right now because, again, a lot of the moves we saw on Taiwan were not due to Trump. They had, Trump, I don't think, had any real hand in crafting Taiwan policy other than he wanted to be tough on China, and that translates into more support for Taiwan in this context. So we need to really see who Biden is bringing into his administration. Are they going to be some of these figures who have taken a more cautious line on Taiwan? Or because there are also plenty of Democrats who have robust support for Taiwan as a fellow democracy that, values human rights and the rule of law and fairness. So I think there's room for actual more engagement, more value-driven diplomacy between the U.S. and Taiwan. But again, it's a question of, is this going to be a priority for the Biden administration the way people in Taiwan would like it to be?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's always good to have that reminder that the unofficial U.S. relationship with Taiwan is primarily led by Congress under the auspices of the Taiwan Relations Act. And we talked about bipartisanship on China. If there's anywhere where there's even stronger bipartisan agreement, it's on that relationship with Taiwan. So that again, I think is an encouraging sign if you're in Taipei and concerned about Chinese moves. Let's close out a little bit by talking about defense. So the Biden administration is going to be coming in under obviously a very interesting fiscal environment with pandemic recovery really being the top issue on the agenda and fiscal constraints on defense. But broadly speaking, everybody I've talked to, seems to think that this idea of great power competition with China is here to stay. And if anything, the Biden administration might de-emphasize the Russia component of great power competition and up the emphasis on China. And there's a lot of issues. I mean, Biden on the campaign trail spoke a lot about how alliances were really agenda item number one when it came to foreign policy, shoring up American alliances. If you're in Beijing and you're just thinking about the issues like the South China Sea, East China Sea, potentially the idea of a conflict or crisis in the Taiwan Strait, the Himalayas where China's been locked in now a months long half a year of disputes with India over their disputed border. How do you think Beijing views the prospects of a Biden transition? I mean, is this something really just more business as usual and continuity as far as they're concerned, or is this news that is to be welcomed in some ways?
There is a lot of debate over who China preferred to win the U.S. election. And as David Wertheim pointed out in his newsletter, I think it depends on who you personally back for presidential candidate, right? Trump supporters say, oh, China wants Biden to win because Biden's soft on China and he's not going to do the things he needs to do to compete with China. And Biden supporters would say, well, China much prefers President Trump because he erodes American power and he's destroying relations with our allies. I think probably views in China are fairly divided on that too, and I think you can make an argument that this is really a lose-lose situation for them. You know, on the one hand, you have President Trump, who is going to keep issuing these unexpected, out of nowhere proclamations on Twitter about China. He's going to keep up with racist attacks about the Chinese virus and accusing China of creating COVID-19. And he's unpredictable, but he also has an incredibly hawkish administration. Pompeo is certainly one of the least popular figures in Beijing official circle these days. But then you also have Biden, who's basically pledging to do the thing that Beijing has always most feared, which is build up a multinational coalition to pressure China into changing its behavior. I think we saw evidence of that concern when Foreign Minister Wang Yi's first trip after the COVID outbreak was to Europe, where he tried pretty unsuccessfully, frankly, to convince the Europeans that, you know, their best interests were to be served by working with China, not by getting tough on China. And certainly the wolf warrior diplomacy approach has not been helping there. So I think, honestly, China had a lot at stake in this election in that the outcome is going to seriously impact China, but it didn't have much to gain from either result. It's just a matter of, you know, which type of unpleasant scenario is China going to be facing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, Shannon, thank you so much for joining me today for this. I know it's still very early and there's a lot of these questions that just don't have great answers yet that we'll learn more about as the transition proceeds, and certainly when we learn more about the personnel composition of a Biden administration. But I really want to thank you for sharing your insight on these issues today.
Yeah, we're at the Diplomat. We're going to be following this very closely, and you know, we've also been covering what Biden means for China, what Biden means for Taiwan, what Biden means for Hong Kong. So you can click on over and check those articles out.
Absolutely. And like I said at the onset, listeners, we'll do a few more episodes with editors at the Diplomat covering various regions of the Asia-Pacific region. Plan is next to have Sebastian Strangio on to talk a bit about the reaction in and around Southeast Asia to the prospects of a Biden presidency. So we'll see you soon then. So check back in for more. Thanks for listening.